Gotta get my herded. Here we go. All right. Popular 14. Take one. Hey CCOF students, my name is Wes. I'm one of the pastors at CCOF. So glad you're joining us for this 14th episode of Popular. Now, if you're just joining in, Popular is a conversation we've been having about influence, which is the ability to affect somebody's behavior, decisions, or choices. And our whole goal in building influence is to help one more person follow Jesus. Now, this week we've been talking about specifically the things that get in the way of our influence. On Tuesday, we had a Trinity practice that was confession, which is being honest and open with God and trusted others about the deep failures in our lives so that we can experience healing and restoration. Now, today is Thursday, and you know what that means. It's story time. It started when I was like 8 or 9. My dad would bring McCole Shorty over for dinner. He would pick him up from work and drive him to our house, and he would eat dinner. And then my parents and we would all go to their neighborhood group, their life group together. McCole was one of the best like football players our city had ever seen, but when in his junior wrestling season, he was in an accident and ended up paralyzed from the waist down. McCall was an African American. He was the first guy I knew who had a different skin tone than mine that I really had a good relationship with. And I loved McCall. Like he had this smile that was just infectious. His laugh could light up the room. And boy, could he give a great hug. And probably just as important, McCall was the first African American guy I knew that wasn't an athlete or an entertainer. He was just a guy. He loved Jesus like I did, and he loved people like I did, and he loved food like I did. I mean, he was just like me. See, what God was doing, I think, in that relationship was laying a foundation for an understanding that people who look different than me are just like me. Then when I was 15, my cousin, who couldn't have kids of her own, decided to adopt 2 kids from Ethiopia, both of which obviously African Americans. That was the first time in my life that I realized that the family of God, the people who follow Jesus, were made up of people from every continent, tribe, tongue, skin tone, ethnicity. That God was very much interested in having a family where everyone was included. I love what our founding pastor Jim Dorman said once. He said, "There is only one Christian nation, and that is the church." The church being the followers of Jesus, the people who are bringing heaven to earth in Jesus' name. And so I learned not only were people of color just like me, that God loved them just like he loved me. And that trend continued. My cousin went on to adopt another African American kid. My other cousin adopted 2 other children of color, and then I married my wife, and she also has 2 Ethiopian cousins that were adopted, and then 2 other cousins who were adopted that are people of color. God has continually put people in my life that aren't like me. Then when I was in college, I met 2 incredible African American men that I consider really good friends. The first was Renard Ballard. Renard was a football player like myself. We played the same position and we became really good friends. He hung out in my room with my roommate Brian and I, and we had a lot of good conversations. Renard told me about what it was like to be pulled over as an African American man. He told me about how he had to be very careful to keep his hands on the steering wheel and use yeses and nos and sirs and ma'ams and to put his ID and his registration on his dash so that it was very clear that he wasn't making any sort of suspicious movements. He was treated almost as though he was guilty of something when he wasn't. I just had never been treated by the police that way. I'd been pulled over a number of times and always been treated with respect and trust. The other guy I met in college was Cedric Smith. Cedric was a national champion hurdler. He was an incredible athlete, but a way better man. And Ced grew up in Phoenix. He told me about the times where he would walk through convenience stores and be followed by the owner. About how he had to be careful about having his hands out of his pockets when he went into stores and make sure he took his hoodie off. Things that I could do without thinking about it. How people were suspicious of him just because of what he looked like or how he dressed. Again, experiences that I didn't have. Now, see, at this point in my life, I never would have called myself a racist, right? Like, I would have said that the Civil War was a horrible thing and that the Confederate Army and those in the South who fought for slavery were wrong, and I would have believed incorrectly that slavery doesn't exist anymore. I would have told you that I wasn't a racist, but I still made a lot of racist jokes. And I talked about Hispanic and Native and black brothers and sisters like they didn't matter. And for the first time, I had learned that people of color were just like me, and I had learned that Jesus loves people of color just like he loves me. But I had yet to wrestle with some of the small and silent prejudices that were inside of me. It was only by rubbing shoulders with these incredible men of God that I was able to see the error in my thinking. See, it was, in fact, this was the first time I began to understand that following Jesus and harboring any sort of racial tendencies were totally incompatible ideas. And I began to understand that Jesus' concept of racial diversity was something he included at the very beginning. In Matthew 15, he has this talk with this woman who's from another country, and he tells her that he wants her to be included in God's family. It was at this point in my life I was pretty confident that God had done everything he needed to do in me on the subject of racism. I had dealt with some of those inner prejudices and apologized and tried to move in a new direction in my life, which God honored, but Jesus had more to accomplish. I used to be a youth pastor in Florida, and while I was there, I got a phone call one day from Ronald's mom. Now, Ronald was a guy who had gotten into a little bit of trouble, not unlike most of us in high school, and had to do some community service. And his mom was hoping that I might take him on to clean some stock rooms or something like that. And we entered into a relationship, Ronald and I learned about him and his family and his background and his dreams. And Ronald today is a really successful film producer. Then there was Quavion. Quavion was this guy who grew up in Indiana in kind of a rough part of town, got invited to church by the family of some kids he was playing with one day, and like went to church that day and never left. And it became apparent as he grew older that God was really going to use Quavion in some powerful ways. And so there was this group of men and women in that church that loved on him and supported him and resourced him in pretty powerful ways. He went to Bible college, and one summer he wanted to do an internship with my boss, who was one of those guys at that church in Indiana. And because I was the student guy and that's an area he was interested in, he became an intern under me. And through Ronald and Quavion, God taught me that there was more than just dealing with internal prejudices. I was listening to an Instagram video this week from Dr. Tony Evans. He's an African-American pastor, and Dr. Tony said this. It was amazing. He said, racism is comprised of two things: prejudice and power. I had dealt with prejudice, but I had yet to deal with power. See, what I learned from Ronald and Quavion was that I had a responsibility, like the Good Samaritan, to care for, in risky and expensive ways, all of my neighbors. To love people the way Jesus did. I realized that I had been given opportunities just because of where I was born and the parents I had that other people didn't get. And that God, in fact, Jesus was calling me not just to use those things for myself, but to open the doors so that others could experience them too. For the first time in my life, I was dealing with power. See, the story of my life today is how God took me from being a quiet racist to a lover of all people. And see, my confession is that I'm a recovering racist. I try not to make jokes about other people that put them down. I try not to bow to the preconceived notions or assumptions about people from other places or with other skin tones. I try really hard to listen to the experiences of others and am intentional about building friendships with people who are not like me. I'm a recovering racist by the grace of Jesus. I want to love my native brothers and sisters, my Hispanic brothers and sisters, and my African American brothers and sisters, because I think that's what Jesus is calling us to do. Thanks for joining us, guys. We'll see you right back here tomorrow for the deep dive.